soon enough happened to be in 3 days. Jabulner was quick to amass an assault on Halhudor. Zelri didn't even need to be on the top of the mountains to see the mass of raiders being assembled right outside their gates. Somehow, word must have spread that Chief Gragtuk was away with a few of his advisors. If they weren't planning any sneaky tricks, it would still be a one-sided fight, though Halhudor would take quite a few casualties. But we can make it none, Zelri thought, stepping up to the chieftain's hut where she knew a war council was in session. With the final product stowed away in her bag, she stepped into the hut. No one noticed her past their squabbling. Dulrang acted as head of the table, and next to him stood a tall orc with colored leather armor and a magnificent mess of braids flowing down his broad shoulders. Gragtuk's brother, Nantuk, was here, as well as a dozen other leaders of the tribe. Once again, it seems Zelri must have missed the invite to join them in devising a counterattack. So she simply blended into the shadows as the rest of them discussed the situation. What if we attack their camp? No, a frontal retaliation is needed. Just let the livestock trample them to death. Then we'd have no food. Enough! Dulrang raised his arms. I was given honor of chief in command while Gragtuk is away, and I will enforce it. He pointed to a slender orc who stood nearest to the door. Delden, amass any orcs who can fight. We meet our enemies on our own terms. If they desire bloodshed, then so it shall be. Brother, Zelri intervened. But Delden was quick to take orders and was already out of the hut. Dulrang sneered at his sister. What is it? If you would all listen to reason. Zelri stepped out of the shadows, careful not to stand too much on her sore leg. I might have another solution. Everyone at the table groaned. Complaints were spewed, and Dulrang did nothing to calm them down. We don't need any of your silly magic, Zelri. Once this pathetic skirmish is over, we'll mount a counter-assault with the rest of our kin and wipe out their outpost for good. Besides, you said you didn't have the ingredients to pull it off. You didn't give me the necessary reagents, so I improvised. Zelri grinned wickedly as she produced the Alpha Kraktuli horn. The temperature of the room dropped as she placed it on the table with a ringing thud. Sharpened, cracked, and glowing with a red tint. The others stepped back as she explained. Power overwhelming is among us, my fellow kin. With this simple trinket, I'm positive a single warrior can defeat their entire force. Dulrang's eyes widened before they narrowed once more at his suspicious sibling. Did you sneak into the spring? I would never do such a thing. No, you would. Dulrang pinched his temples. The guards reported a shadowy figure at the spring, and there were a few chunks of ice the other day stuck in the river gatehouse. That, and I haven't seen you since I told you your plan wasn't going to happen. Regardless, it's finished now. She grabbed the horn and strolled around the room. Isn't anyone actually curious anymore? Occasionally, Zelri would wave the horn in front of the other orcs, who would recoil in fear and disgust. Aren't you tired of a feeble existence? Constantly under the threat of your own neighbors? Well, I have the solution right here. Aren't any of you happy? Is anybody ready to jump aboard the boat of history? Any ship you're sailing is already sunk. Dulrang shook his head. Putting his hand out, he simply stated, Give me the horn. So you accept? Zelri joked. I'm going to destroy it. Zelri felt as if her brow would collapse in on itself. After all this work, after putting forth all this effort for doing what is best for the tribe, you would miss the opportunity to save lives because you're scared of a few magic tricks? Dulrang lunged for the horn, but Zelri was already stepping away. From her bag, she withdrew a glass capsule containing a gray powder. Shouting her spell, she threw it in her brother's face, where it exploded in a cloud of thick fog. Ignoring the coughing and accusating shouts, Zelri hobbled away to the lift. If they can't imagine the power that I could give them with their feeble minds, then I'll just have to show it. Making her way toward the entrance of the village, Zelri noted that orcs were already massing along platforms, bearing their tribal spears. Weapons that they won't even have to use. Approaching the gatehouse, a guard noticed her coming toward him and a few others. "We aren't letting anyone out right now. The acting chieftain is my brother." Zelri glared up at the guard. "And you will do well to let me pass under his orders." "Listen, I haven't gotten any orders to..." He silenced himself when a tip of a crimson horn was pressed against his neck. "Okay, fine. You may exit, although I have to say it's a terrible idea." "Noted." Zelri retracted the horn. She waited for a soldier to open one of the smaller gates, just enough for her to squeeze through. Once she was outside the wall, she could see Jabulner's ranks casually approaching from across the sandscape outside Hal Hudor. Zelri began to have second thoughts. Storming out of an argument with her ignorant brother was one thing, and going against her father's wishes was another. Now she stood before a small army by her lonesome. There was no wind to calm the sweat she was working up. She marched forward, gripping the horn tightly, doing her best to keep her back straight, her eyes staring forward. To meet the enemy head-on. Hal Hudor built itself upon innovation. Its people were some of the earliest orcs who had the idea that things could be done a different way. A better way. Slowly, their drive for change was stooping down to the levels of their rivals. "I can fix that." Zelri's breath was becoming staggered. She could see the spears and shields and axes that their enemies held. Most of them appeared to notice her, but they kept their gaze toward Hal Hudor. By herself, she wasn't even a trifling concern, so wholly insignificant that they couldn't be bothered to waste a javelin. Briefly, a flash of mortal fear sparked, driving out other thoughts of bravery from Zelri's mind. What was she doing? She didn't even know if the spell would work, much less to the extent she wanted it to. Perhaps this was a fool's dream. Maybe she should run back to the gates. She might have enough time to get back inside before the first soldiers of Jabulner closed the distance. Safely inside the canyon, she could wait out the storm, apologize to her brother, turn in the horn, and live another day while the rest of the tribe drove off the invaders. All she had to do was give up on her aspirations. Be part of the tribe like everyone else. Do what her chieftain, her father, told her to do. To go back to never being given a chance to do anything. Zelri looked back at Hal Hudor. A line of orcs formed on the walls lining the pass, with bows no doubt, ready to fire on command. She could faintly see the hulking figure of Nantuk rising above the others. Duelring would be close behind, desperate to see her fail. Feeling like she would crush the horn she worked so hard for in her hand, Zelri raised it above her head. Without a shout, the horn was driven straight between her neck and shoulder. Blood spewed from the grievous wound. Zelri stumbled over kneeling, dust and sand puffed up from the ground. She coughed violently, all of her natural instincts screaming at her to remove the thing piercing her flesh. The pain stopped, replaced with a rush of exhilarating energy surging through her body. Blood ceased to pour from the wound. Veins grew more defined under her green skin. Pulsating bolts of ruby streamed along her body and, though she could not see it, Zelri's eyes burned a bright crimson. Aside from being a little lightheaded, Zelri felt the greatest she ever had before. Healthy, nimble, powerful. Shifting her robes aside, she ripped off the bandages wrapped around her injured leg. Small jolts of red electricity stitched the recovering wound back together. In an instant, it was good as new. Better than new. Godly. All around her, she could see faint streams of flowing blood suspended in the air. Transparent and thin, dozens of them stretched to the horizon, streaming in from the distance. Most stemmed from Hal Hudor. Zelri looked at the army now within 100 feet of her, no longer seeing it as impossible. All she saw were test subjects. Faster than she knew was possible of her own body, she ran straight toward the front lines. The soldiers raised their spears and shields at her sudden advance. Someone threw a javelin, aiming right for Zelri's head. It whistled through the air in slow motion for the sorceress. Raising her left hand, she released a stream of red energy toward it. They collided in the air with a crack, sending the scorched weapon flying away. The orcs ceased their advance, instead focusing on a defensive position, which would prove to do nothing in their favor. Once Zelri reached the first orc's shield, she punched right through it, gripping his arm hard enough that she drew blood. Feeling blood coat her fingers, an idea raced through Zelri's head. One so grim that she never thought about it before. Retracting her arm, she commanded the orc's blood to give her its strength. It reacted accordingly, fueling the spell that formed in her mind so naturally, so quickly, almost as if the power could be channeled as easily as it was to draw lines in the sand. The orc's blood raced through the air, latching onto the splinters of the shield suspended. Once the wine strands found their marks, they shot outward, driving the wooden shards into the enemy at an incredible speed. Zelri could hear, she could feel the last breaths of these fools leave their lips as the projectiles found their mark. It seemed that was not enough to ward off the rest of them. Warriors all around her cried their battle cries and raised their weapons, charging her with reckless abandon. Those who didn't threw javelins, shot their slings, or fired arrows. Zelri could feel something through the strands that linked her to her relatives. Power through blood called to her, begging to be used. While wicked blades slashed her flesh, she merely took deep breaths. Arrow tips would pierce her skin, only to burn as ash flowing from her sealing wounds. In a single fluid motion, Zelri thrust her arms out at either side. Channeling her newfound power through her fingertips, there was a deafening boom. Shockwaves sent up the assailants flying back on top of each other, piling up into stacks of helpless orcs. Red electricity crackled around her like a storm. Raising her hand and clenching it, a javelin formed from the aura. Condensing into a crude, crackling replica that was far too big to be used as a weapon, she threw it at one of the piles, watching as it passed straight through the middle. Blood lightning bounced between all of them. Behind the pile, she could feel the javelin take more lives as it raced through the ranks before finally exploding on the ground. Zelri cackled wickedly. Her own ears popped from the pressure it added to the desert air. Somewhere, someone called for a retreat. A few soldiers complied, trying their best to move back. Most, in traditional orc stubbornness, stayed and screamed at Zelri, only wanting to fuel their strange affection for battle. And, if she was to be honest with herself, Zelri was happy to oblige. There was no resistance stepping through the sweat-soaked sands layered with fallen weapons. Though her robes had become tattered, Zelri's skin grew nigh impenetrable. Spear shafts and bones alike broke like twigs, but that was far too boring. She much preferred finding new ways to channel this power radiating from the spike in her shoulder. By far the easiest way she found was to use the blood of her enemies. Opening a wound on a soldier's chest, Zelri could rip out a stream of blood, shaping it into a long, hardened chain, red static surging through crystallized clots as she whipped it around. She could feel her magic yearn to take the life essence of anyone it touched, so she would, extending the chain beyond normal measure, reaching ever further into the dwindling ranks of Jabulner. More orcs retreated at the sight of her chain, but it was futile. Releasing her hold on the conjured object, Zelri lunged toward a terrified swordbearer. With a fluid motion, she tore a long wound along their abdomen. Blood cascaded in front of her, arcing horizontally. With a wave of her palm, the fluid crystallized into daggers, flinging themselves towards any coward she could see and beyond. Each one pierced its target, then two more. This continued, with Zelri's power growing stronger by the minute, coming up with even more creative uses for this gift. Typically, magic was limited for each being for a single day. Using reagents, gems, and other items of arcane attunement, one could hope to extend their influence and might. Who knew, Zelri thought, crushing the skull of a pathetic archer, that all it would cost was a bit of blood. An easy price to pay when it was not your own. But the real price would soon show itself. As the scattered assaulting force of Jabulner was in full retreat, Zelri could feel a tugging on her heart. Finally coming to her senses, she looked around and noticed that only a few of the blood streams were left. Those that were faint and fickle. A few spaces missing every now and again, where a constant stream of ichor should be. A sharp pain gripped Zelri's heartbeat, causing it to pulse faster. Falling to her knees, she looked down at her chest, where her heart glowed through her skin and clothes, beating, aching. But the glow surrounding it grew dimmer each second, and while Zelri could feel her power continue to grow, she could also feel that the power was being ripped from her own blood. The reserve of her own magic had run dry, as well as those of her connections. Now the spell was forcing her to use her own life force to fuel itself.
No!
Zelry screamed. She never spoke in this new omnipotent form, and it sounded unnatural, like her voice was being amplified while she was being dragged down an abyss. Her hands scrambled for the horn now driven deeper into her shoulder. Barely getting a grip, she commanded this power, her power, to release its vice on her flesh. But it didn't want to. The thing fought back against her will, yearning for more power to amplify itself, and in turn, her.
Release me!
Zelry's arms struggled, straining against this thing she had created, that she so willingly embedded into herself. Her heartbeat finally began to slow down, dwindling to its normal pace, then further and further until it was getting fatally sluggish. Thinking quickly, Zelry tore open a wound on her own arm. Drawing forth her own lifeblood, she formed a sanguine claw around the horn and, with one final push of energy, yanked it out. Immediately she felt the power vanish from her veins. All the crimson electricity jolting around her dissipated. Every muscle in her body felt drained. Before she passed out, she could see the horn crumble to particles, mixing with the coarse sand. Footsteps rumbled behind her as her mind descended into restless darkness. When Zelry finally came through, her head rang. Her teeth pulsed. Her muscles felt like cracked sandstone. Veins on fire, like they were still burning from the spell. Opening her eyes, she made out several tables lined with apothecary's tools. A stone fireplace stood apart from the wooden walls, a small, crackling fire burning. As her eyesight became more clear, Zelry could also see the new scars on her body. Fresh, dark lines crisscrossed along her arms. Blotches of still healing tissue marked where arrows penetrated her skin. On her chest, her legs, even the tops of her feet were covered with barely fading cuts. She traced a finger between her neck and right shoulder, feeling a deep hole that burned in agony at her own touch. Sister? Zelry shifted her head to see Dulrang standing in the doorway, sunlight peeking from behind curtains. Only, he seemed different. Dulrang, not quite having a form chiseled from stone before, now looked deathly gaunt. His cheekbones were well indented on his face. The clothes he always wore were baggy. Arms exposed, they looked more like branches snapped off a rotting tree. As he took a seat next to her bed, she could hear his breathing, labored and deep. Before, Zelry could always see a fierce passion in her brother's eyes, an unrelenting thirst for knowledge and triumph. Now all she could see was fear and a desire to rest. Awake? He asked. Zelry nodded, attempting to sit up. She could, at the cost of heaving over her bedside, but Dulrang didn't seem to care. What have you done? What? She started, being interrupted by her own breath. What do you mean? Out there, 2 days ago. The soldiers. The battle. The blood. Dim light from the fire reflected off her brother's exhausted pupils. The price we paid. Price? Everything was rushing back to her. All the power she felt. Each life she took. I risked my life and used their own against them. And won. A crooked grin formed on her scarred, mangled face. I won. Did you really? Dulrang stood up slowly, shuffling around the tables, holding his clothes close to him. I could see them too, you know. The trails. The chains that bound us together. You did? Zelry was astonished. As far as she knew, only she should have been able to see the full reach of the spell. Near the end, you felt it too, didn't you? A hunger. Ceaseless. Cold. He shivered, despite it being quite warm in the hut. Now you left us open for retaliation. Don't be so dramatic. Zelry stretched her legs, listening to her joints creak. Even Jabulner wouldn't be able to come back from that so soon. I'm sure once Father's back, he and Nan took to make a decision on how to deal with them. Duelring snapped his gaze back to his sister. Nantuk is dead, Zell. What? How? Your spell! Duelring shouted, coughing from raising his hoarse voice. It took his life force. He's nothing more than a shriveled corpse now. Kinda like you? Not just me. Duelring shambled closer to the bedside. Anyone else that had a blood tie to us, to Gragtuk. As far as we know, you and I are the only ones who survived. We still don't have word of Gragtuk's health. Zelri's mind reeled with this information. Only 2 survivors from nearly 100 or so blood relatives, if she had to make a guess. And she had all the power from all of them. But it backfired. Running her hands through her hair, she managed to stay up and stay that way. I can't believe that this all happened. She could see her brother express an untold anger toward her, but she ignored it. Everything that happened out in that field, it was extraordinary. Extraordinary? Sister, so many have been taken from us by your witchcraft. In error on my part, it almost claimed my life too. New experimental ideas formed in her mind. I just need to put some sort of limiter on it. Something to prevent this from happening again. Again? Oh no, Zelri. Duelring shook his gaunt head. Nothing like this is ever happening again. But I can make it better, Zelri exclaimed, a wide, exhilarating look in her eyes. I just need a few more materials. Maybe I should take some notes. She began searching the tables for her possessions. It's gone, Zell, Duelring said. I destroyed it. Burned it in the fire where it should have gone long, long ago. Your career of plaguing us is over. Zelri took deep breaths in a poorly hidden attempt to calm down. Her future was kept in that book of magic. Found hidden beneath the earth in a land far from here, possibly lying in wait for centuries just waiting for its secrets to be discovered. Now it was all gone because of fear. No, Zelri thought. Not entirely. I still remember the most important things. I still know how to make the horn. Duelring sighed, heading toward the entrance. Once you've recovered and we learn of the state of Gragtuk, there will be a council to decide on your fate. My vote is exile, if you want to know. I know most of the others are recommending death. Zelri went wide-eyed at the mention of death. Her dying would guarantee no one else could take up the mantle. Everyone else in Halhudor, Jabulner, and most of the other Orc clans wouldn't have the spine to do what she did in the name of progress. Adrenaline surged within her weary body. Giving herself into it, Zelri stumbled for the sharpest scalpel she could find. Duelring whirled around in the commotion, only to feel an intense pain rack his mind as the medicinal blade was plunged into his gut. I'm sorry, brother. Zelri covered his mouth, but she didn't need to. Any energy the Orc had was long gone. After a pitiful gaze into his sister's eyes, Duelring's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Zelri, trying to think as pragmatic as possible, dipped her fingertips in the fresh wound. Muttering some words to herself, she could feel the blood wanting its fading powers to be used. Unfortunately, unlike before, her beckoning did nothing. Spilt blood was blood, nothing more. Perhaps she needed more power herself to forcibly take the life force of other creatures. She would have to make a note on that later when she escaped Halhudor. Stripping her brother's corpse of its cloak, she turned it inside out and, after strapping on her bag of reagents, stepped outside, hood down. Hoping no one would bother entering the hut for some time, she made her way toward one of the lifts. She knew a spell that could help her fall from great heights safely. Once she was above most of the riffraff, Zelri could easily descend the mountain. A few places of refuge popped into her mind, particularly among Halhudor's other enemies. Equally ambitious and cunning as she was, merely lacking power. Power that she now knew how to provide in ample supply. While everything didn't play out the way she had originally hoped, she had to admit, it produced a far more riveting prospect for the future.